Hello everyone, Jacob here. In today's lesson we're going to go over this expression, to a large extent. And in Korean this means 대체로는, and it's very similar to other expressions that you probably know, just mostly or in general. Okay, and it's not super common, but since we went over to a certain extent in the last video, if you haven't seen that, by the way, please click this link and check it out. So since we went over to a certain extent, I just quickly want to go over to a large extent, which is just kind of another way to say mostly or in general. So let's look at one example and then we will move on. To a large extent, the cost of living in Korea is low. Okay, so what is cost of living? This means 생활비, and we usually say the cost of living is low or the cost of living is high, like in Korean. And I think that this is true. The cost of living in Korea is low. You can go to a restaurant and only spend about 5,000 won. What else? You know, rent is actually quite cheap, I think, in Korea. In Seoul, I heard it's a little bit more expensive, but in Busan, you know, it's quite cheap. So you could say, to a large extent, the cost of living in Korea is low. And this just means mostly or in general. It means like there may be some things that are kind of expensive, and I do think that's true in Korea. For example, meat is quite expensive, or even cheese is pretty expensive. But to a large extent, the cost of living in Korea is low. Okay, so that is how we use to a large extent. Since we went over to a large extent, I just really quickly just want to go over to a small extent, which has a different meaning, obviously. This would mean 조금만, to a small extent. And it's not really common, but it is used sometimes. So again, just another good expression to know and to use instead of always using the same basic common expressions. So this, like I said, would just be very similar to a little bit, which is definitely more common, but still this to a small extent can be useful. So I'll give you one example and then we'll finish the lesson. American TV shows can help, or can only help your English. American TV shows can only help your English to a small extent. A lot of Korean people like to study by watching American TV shows or American movies, and I think this can be helpful, but I also think that American TV shows can only help your English to a small extent. So basically only a little bit. But that's just what I think. That's my personal advice if you're studying English. You know, don't spend too much time studying TV shows or movies because it only helps your English to a small extent. Alright, so now we've gone over to a certain extent, now we've gone over to a large extent, and also to a small extent. So we know how to use all of these expressions that use this word extent, and now we can move on. I hope you understood the lesson, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.